I certainly hope that over lunch you had the opportunity to reconnect with old friends, but also the opportunity to meet new friends and potential business partners and collaborators on some of the opportunities that we hope certainly will come out as part of this summit's outcomes by the end of tomorrow, as well as the SA-Italy week as a whole. Now, as we set up the first two sessions earlier on, we did discuss that we would want to get into the detail of what were the priorities, what were the constraints, what were the resources, the talents, the skills, and the competitive measures that we need to make sure that interregional trade does occur, but more importantly, that the partnerships that we form here today and moving through this week are partnerships where we can exchange value, are partnerships where we can exchange goods, products, and services, and are partnerships that are going to contribute and impact positively on economic growth, not just in Africa, but also to our counterparts who are based in Europe, who we are planning at least already are partnered with. Now, it's important within the context of this to note that the Ambrosetti Group is a think tank, and they do an extensive amount of research, not only within the company itself, but also with the partners that they develop and form collaborations with in the countries where they operate. And it's a pleasure this afternoon to note that a number of the advisory board members who have come together to constitute this SA-Italy Summit are with us. You will hear from them. And one of them this afternoon is sitting on my panel this afternoon and is about to open this next session for us with a position paper which he has written for the purposes of this summit, which I certainly hope that as he goes through the findings and the thought leadership that has gone into the position paper, you will take away from it points as well as information that will help you accelerate your ability to contribute to the economic imperatives that this summit is here to help us with this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, my next speaker on this panel, who will be speaking on deploying an intermodal connectivity platform, business opportunities coming from this South Africa-Italy cooperation this afternoon, is Mr. Alec Irwin. Mr. Irwin is now the chairman of UBU Investment Holdings, but to many South Africans, he is well known as a former minister within our government, firstly as the Minister of Public Enterprises, and later on as a Minister of Trade and Industry in South Africa. And through South Africa's very formative years as a democracy, he was in many times at the forefront at developing economic policy, as well as many of the issues that we are here today to discuss, change, amend, and grow with and from. So please give him a very warm welcome to the stage, and when he is done, I'll introduce you to everyone else.
Well, thank you very much, not Mrs. Ntuli, but thank you very much, Lynette. The presentation you're about to see is of too high a quality for an old chap like me to have put together. So I really need to give credit to the Ambrosetti team. It's a background presentation which we'll look at. And when Lynette introduces the team, I must say I personally can't think of a better group of speakers and participants for looking at this issue in Southern Africa and Africa as a whole. So let's kick off. The basic presentation deals with the centrality of transportation and South Africa's potential, which is to me very clear, to become a real point of connectivity. I'm not going to read through all that. You can have a look at that. But the key points, as you can see, and as speakers, the Premier outlined it earlier, South Africa is a major player in trade, not just in Africa, but in the world. And our location, basically, when you think about it, links with at least two of the world's greatest trading systems. The one that is emerging faster than anything is that between China, India, Africa, Europe. And South Africa is very centrally placed for that. And of course, our traditional trading links with the Atlantic Basin, with Europe and the Americas, is still very strong. And if you watch South Africa's trading patterns, they're growing very, very rapidly with both those two massive trading systems. I'll say a bit more about the Chinese one because we're not watching it closely enough a bit later. Trade will increase, and we'll show you some interesting figures later. And our infrastructure is well developed, and you've got people here who can outline its strengths and weaknesses. But basically, it's without question the strongest in Africa. In terms of performance, you can see that although we sometimes are critical of ourselves, the logistical infrastructure is competitive. There's no question about it. We're always looking for ways to improve it, and I think you're going to hear some things this afternoon which are looking at that. Up until now, in more recent times, the participation in the rail sector by the private sector has been less. But I think, and these will be outlined to you, there's some really exciting opportunities that are emerging. I myself have no doubt whatsoever, and I hope some of the speakers will elaborate on this, that the rail sector will be massive in Africa in the next 2 decades. There's no question about it, and we'll explain why that's the case. I'm assuming you read faster than I talk, so I'm not reading these slides to you. I'm just commenting as we go along. One point that we were discussing as speakers over lunch, which is obvious to anyone involved in trade or for any industry involved in logistics, the key is the intermodality of it. How quickly can you move your product across different logistical systems, across different borders? I'll give you one example of something that we've been working on in Africa. It's a very sophisticated industry, the automotive industry. And the automotive industry, if your logistical costs are above 15%, there's almost no chance that you will be able to locate any kind of manufacturing activity in your economy. For many years, South Africa was right on that edge, 15%. But if you can bring it under 10 or so, it would be very useful. Studies we've done for West Africa, the logistical costs would be somewhere in the region of 25 to 30. So I'm trying to stress through that example just how crucial this intermodal activity is. Speed of movement across modes, not just in the one, but across the modes and across the borders. As you've seen, and Transnet, and I hope Sia will say something about this, have done an excellent demand study over this area, and it's quite clear that the growing sophistication of products traded across Africa requires an intermodal system. So there'll be opportunities, and I hope you'll hear a few of them this afternoon. Read the slide, but for me, when you think rail and you think rail equipment, one of the countries that has to come into your mind must be Italy. So it's quite clear that the prospects for a partnership here are really interesting. If you look at the turning points, the Tambo Spring intermodal point, I've just heard a bit more about it today. I must say I'm massively excited. I think it could well revolutionize logistics in South Africa. South Africa is unusual because our massive industrial heartland, because of the gold, lies hundreds of kilometers from the coast. So rail's always been very important for us. And one of the great problems we have in South Africa is that we're one of the highest industrial areas in the world. We ride up 1,500 meters. So our trains have to climb one of the highest escarpments in any continent, which creates difficulties. So this kind of intermodal efficiency is absolutely crucial to compensate for the basic topographical challenges that South Africa faces. I thought this is a very interesting slide, prepared by the Ambrosetti think tank. But look at that. This is compounded annual growth rates up to 2044. These are exports to, imports from, total trade. That is pretty significant. This is from our nearest neighbors, the ones that would tend to use our systems. if you were to think of that just in terms of absolute size, then the current system that we have is going to be more than doubling. It's really a significant growth. The message is, number one, take this whole intermodal system seriously, but number two, exciting prospects. So what we're looking at is the future of the logistics and transportation sector in SADC, but also in broader Africa, and I'll say a little bit in a moment. Intermodal is critical. Chris was saying over the lunch, and he's right. These days, a shipper is not interested in your rail costs, interested in the cost from the factory to the door. And that's what intermodality is about. There was a question from Tseke about customs. African customs systems are still very weak. We have borders that are too slow, trucks can't get across them. We did speculate whether this was a plot by Transnet and Zambian Rail to slow down the trucks, but that was just a wild speculation. But clearly we need to speed things up. We're looking at the cooperation, and Nino and Sia will say something about that. But the opportunities are massive. Very quick example. Ronnie and Tuli and I, and he may say more about this, have been involved in Nigeria for about 10 years. Most people think of Nigeria, they think of oil. Actually, it's one of the richest economies in Africa. It's got a massive raw material, minerals, agriculture. The reason it's not exploited, you can't move one thing from one place to another. So a country Nigeria's size in present-day Europe would have a massive rail system. A country in Nigeria today has one railway line of any significance, old, out of date. So the prospects are massive. And my last point, we must watch carefully. It's for various reasons. I've been quite heavily involved in watching the Chinese logistical network unfolding. In my 20 years of active involvement in African economies, when I became a minister, I have never seen the speed with which major infrastructure projects are being built in Africa. So new harbors are being built. 2 new massive railway lines have been built. These things are changing, and they're changing because that giant economy that was talked about by Elizabeth earlier needs to trade. And it needs to trade with Africa. And don't make the mistake of thinking it's doing the same as Europe did. It's not. If you watch closely what they're doing, they're locating their manufacturing activity offshore. And the reason they're doing that is, as happened in America, it's more efficient to manufacture closer to your market if there's good logistics. So this is a massive opportunity that we have here in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Mr. Irwin for those opening thoughts. Ladies and gentlemen, you will find the position paper in your pack that you received this morning. And I really do encourage each of you to go into it and read it and unpack what it means to each of you. There's some great statistics in it, but I always am a big believer in that statistics should also begin to work for us, and how do we inculcate what we have learned into what we're trying to do from an economic and from a business sense. Now, I'm the rose amongst many thorns on this stage this afternoon, and I am joined by a panel of guests who are all intimately involved, aligned, and instrumental to the issues related to interconnectivity, whether it's on rail, it's on road, it's from the perspective of the value chain. And the value chain, ladies and gentlemen, is not just about putting stock on the ground, but it's also about the financial implications of it, the production of the different parts that make sure that these different interconnected parts of the logistics framework actually do begin to work. And good afternoon, gentlemen. And as we start our conversation this afternoon, I'd really, for the purposes of the discussion we're embarking on, we've got the key issues up, but each of you work in spaces where those key issues are a summary of the day-to-day impacts that you are able to make through intermodal connectivity. Now, as part of our presentation this afternoon, each of you has been briefed to speak on something that is quite central to what it is that you do in the logistics space. And I'd really like for us to have a conversation and bring people from the audience into certain of the elements that you've seen that are progressive, the constraints that exist within this space. How does the position paper that we have just had unpacked to us complement or perhaps impede what it is that you're trying to do? And I know that already on stage this afternoon, there are a number of partnerships that have already been formed, for instance, between South Africa and Zambia, Italy, South Africa, and many other partners. And what are those partnerships and cooperative agreements actually bringing to the table? What I really want to drive down to as part of this overall conversation, particularly for the business people who are joining us here this afternoon, is how do we make sure that everybody taps and benefits from the value chain, the issues of localization, competitiveness, because we may speak about them from a position paper, from a policy perspective, but at the end of the day, only partnership and activity will make that happen. So, Mr. Irwin, I would like, for the purposes of this afternoon, to start with you and some thoughts around, you've had a lot of time to prepare this particular paper. You've been quite central in many of the conversations that have brought us to the information that you hear. If you were to look at the priorities in spite of the progress and the acceleration of infrastructure development in Africa, if we are now looking forward in 3 to 5 years' time, and I'm wanting to either invest or find a way to divest into the value chain, what are the 3 specific areas you would point me to direct my attention to now?
Well, Lynette, I'm going to be very brief because what's so good about this panel is you've got all of the components of a complex and interesting strategy. And over lunch, we talked amongst ourselves and said, what should each of us maybe highlight a little bit? But I wouldn't say more than what I said, that, look, the rail sector worldwide is crucial. It's alongside automotive and aviation, it's one of the key manufacturing sectors of the world. So the fact that Africa needs so much transportation, in which rail has to play a key role, both for freight and for passenger, it must be an area which we as Africans should be looking at very, very closely. For Gauteng province, logistics is everything because we're so far from the coast. So you've got all the people that can outline things here, and it's a natural partnership, in my view, between Italy and ourselves. You heard Valerio outlining the manufacturing excellence of Italy, which is unquestionable. So here's a partnership, and I'm going to shut up now because I think the rest of your speakers are going to actually tell you some exciting things.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Irwin. Mr. Gama, the Group Chief Executive of Transnet. Transnet, over the last few years, has set very ambitious targets for itself and has put out quite a number of strategies around not only the development of your rail infrastructure, but the expansion and modernization of our ports has also been quite central to that, as well as providing competitive services to your clients, not just in South Africa, but across our borders as well. With that, one of the big questions that come in, Mr. Irwin is saying, let's get in there, let's compete, and let's focus on rail. But I think something that you probably hear quite often is, how do we make sure that in getting in and competing, the areas around cost, the areas around standardization of the service, particularly once we move into other countries around the continent, is no doubt a concern for the people seated at the tables in front of us, but also for you in terms of keeping you competitive and also aligned to your customers' demands and very specific needs. As a business, when you look at those issues now, what are you doing to help and almost bring down the barriers around the better use of the resources related to the infrastructure that you have deployed as a group to match the accelerated need to move things faster, to get into new markets quicker, and make sure that the interregional logistics and almost transport trail of items is something that has less impediments and allows us to progress into the future?
No, thank you very much. It's quite a loaded question. But I think Transnet, from where we sit, is in the enviable position that we've got a system of ports and port terminals as well as railways within us. And it's a unique position in terms of what we ought to do in South Africa in terms of balancing infrastructure for ports as well as infrastructure for rail. And I think you're quite right. Our customers are looking at the reduction in cost, and they're looking at efficiencies. But importantly, as we look at regional integration, one of the biggest and most important aspects is the interoperability of our railway systems, so that we are able to have hassle-free and a seamless integration of trains from within the Southern African development community. It's quite an important aspect, because I think one of the key issues that we've been looking at on the continent is our ability to trade with one another. The intra-African trade, as Africa as a continent, we only have 17% of intra-African trade. If you look at Europe, for instance, it's over 60%. The US is around 45%. So it means that our ability to move commodities amongst ourselves is still being hindered because of the lack of appropriate infrastructure. That is an opportunity in terms of making the kinds of investments that are required to do so. And we've started in Zambia, in Mozambique, Swaziland, and Zimbabwe. We are talking about how we can revitalize the railway systems in order for us to assist this growing population that we have to repatriate quite a lot of goods, mainly raw materials at this point and mining-related products, amongst ourselves, because what we're doing now, what railways do quite well is to link economies and to connect people. And so in terms of the African growth story, I think that railways and ports and regional integration, they're going to be quite important in terms of raising the standards of living and making sure that we grow our economies.
One of the things that's come up in our conversation, particularly over lunch, is that between Transnet as an entity as well as Zambia, there is a partnership that has already been born, and I'm also going to get into the partnership with Italy, particularly around the intermodal freight stations that you have started working on in South Africa. And I think, let me throw forward the next question to Mr. Christopher Musondo, who's the CEO of Zambia Railways. Mr. Musondo, partnership, an integral part of driving not only regional trade, but also regional infrastructure developments that enables you to meet the demands of the future in both our economies. Can you unpack for us in some detail the partnership between yourselves and Transnet, but also the opportunity that it actually represents for business people who are perhaps based either in Italy, in South Africa, and even in your own country today?
Thank you very much. I think let me start with the opportunity of what is the expected benefits to all of us out of this partnership we are going into. Let me refer to Zambia specifically. Zambia, we are in the position today where we are part of the South-North corridor, which is linking South African ports to DRC. Now, whatever happens to DRC or Zambia becomes a bottleneck to everybody down, whether you are coming to Durban or you are going to Dar es Salaam. So what's required is the three themes the paper has elaborated. One of them is the intermodal. We have reached a point where we have no choice but to go that way. In Zambia specifically, 10 years ago, we had an influx of mining investment. And most of those mining investment concentrated on the copper belt. And one of the things we experienced was that some of the plants, like smelters, refinery, made in a very short period. And they made in some areas where there is no railway connectivity. So we are sitting in Zambia where some of the major industrial investors like Dangote are not connected to our system. They are just 12 kilometers from the nearest railway line. So in terms of intermodal, you can put some dry ports in Zambia. Those dry ports would definitely link up to the industries. To put up dry ports, then you are talking about inviting rail, road, and anybody else to participate. You need handlers, you need forwarders, you need customs in those centers so that they can be able to deliver door-to-door facility. As my colleagues have alluded to, today the customer is not looking for railway service. The customer is looking for a logistic solution. Assume you are loading copper on the copper belt coming to Durban. What the customer looks at is how long it has taken you from copper belt to China, not to Durban, not to Harare. How many players are in that chain? You have the loaders, who are the handlers, you have the forwarders, you have the clearing agents, and you have the customs, and you have the borders. These are the players who influence how long it will take you from Zambia to China. In terms of costing, these are the same players who contribute a portion of their cost to the customer. So when you tell the customer, as a railroad, I will charge you $10 from Lusaka or from Kwabelt to Durban, that's not his cost. That's just part of his cost. What the customer wants to do now, how do you integrate all these components into the bottom line costing for him? The only way you do it, we must go into partnership with all those who have something to do with the transportation or provision of logistics up to China. And this is where the competition comes in. Normally, we have said railway on its own, road on its own. But the customer is getting an integrated costing, which could be very high. So you could be thinking your cost is $10, the cost of the customer is $15. So unless we integrate, and one of the integration points is a dry port where you find the intermodal being practically implemented. And that's where this intermodal comes in. In terms of the relationship we're having partnering with Transnet, we are looking forward that the goods are not moving within South Africa alone. In fact, the goods are moving between Congo, DRC, and Lubumbashi or Dar es Salaam, whichever. So the partnership provides synergy. I know very well sometimes the equipment could be sitting here, and in Congo we are just missing a wagon. We are looking at a spare part for a wagon. The partnership allows to talk about provision of equipment, provision of skills to maintain equipment, provision of supply or stocking of the various warehouses where stocks are. So it brings up synergy. It also introduces that the road and the rail, we are not competing. We are supplementing each other. Each one has got a role to play. It comes to the biggest question, optimization of the transport sector. Railway has a role to play. Water transport has a role to play. Road has a role to play. Air has got a role to play. We must make sure that all these various modes reach an optimal point. And that optimal point increases scales, the economic scales of the logistics. It also brings in efficient. And once you become more efficient, you automatically become the destination for investment. For example, if you want to invest in copper mining, it's very fundamental that you know whether the provision of logistics exists in that country or at how much. The presenter was talking about 15-25% cost of logistics. In Zambia, in some products, imports particularly, it goes up to 55%. In Kenya, it's about 45%. Now, assuming you just play around, you affect 10% out of 55%, what will be the cost of products? What will be the margins for the mining sector if they reduce their costing by 10%? This brings us now to intertrade, to growth in the region, and to become the attractive destination for investors. So I think the joint arrangements we're making, either between Transnet and Zambia Railways or any other player in the region, is very critical, and I think we should move forward. Look at China, look at Brazil. China has grown. What is the basis? The basis of China growth is not independent from the expansion of the railway systems. The growth in China, when they were hitting 12%, the railway were growing at 14, 15%. So there's a serious, strong relationship between infrastructure, logistics provision, and the growth of the economy. I thought I should make those points clear.
Thank you very much for those points. So I started getting really excited as you were talking, because what you started opening us to is not just about thinking about business plans, but actually now starting to look at the models of business related to infrastructure and the roll-on effect it has on the areas of optimization, but also what the final cost of goods, products, and even services becomes to the end user, and how that can actually impact the outcome of our economic growth and activity. Nino, is it Singo? Just Nino. Now, Nino is the Vice President of International Projects for Italian State Railways. And your entity, as well as South Africa, have already partnered, in particularly on the Tambo Springs project, which is an intermodal project right here in South Africa. And that partnership has delivered quite a number of optimization strategies and tools to assist with the very issues and constraints that your counterpart from Zambia has raised with us today. Can you just give us a little bit of detail about the outcomes of that partnership and where you see continued areas of synergy as well as growth around these new models related to the management of our logistics framework and chain?
Thank you, Lynette. Thank you, all of you, for this opportunity. Yes, Italian Railways is investing through this really important project, which is Tambo Spring. Tambo Spring is the design, construction, and concession for 20 years of a logistic terminal just here near Johannesburg. We are in this project together with my friend that I see there, Mr. Sello from Southern Palace. We are partners in this project. To explain the essence, the feeling of this partnership that we are building with Transnet Freight Rail, we have to come back to the meaning of intermodality. Intermodality is not a philosophy. Intermodality is an approach that has been driven by customers. Whether we talk about freight or we talk about passengers, it's the same. Because customers are really interested in moving from one origin to one destination. They don't care which will be the mode, but they want to reach a point according to their experience. They want to be safe, they want to be efficient, so punctuality, cleaning. They want that their goods arrive at the proper time and at the convenient cost. When we talk about intermodality, we have to look at another keyword, which is integration. Integration at which level? And I'm saying these keywords because these are, let me say, the spirit of this cooperation with Transnet. The other keyword is integration. Integration means, as our colleague said, integration of infrastructure, because of course if you have to go from one country to another, you need to have the infrastructure. But integration is not only this. Integration is also digitalization of the information, so technology, because customers want to have one single ticket, no matter is the ticket for parking, the ticket for traveling, and the ticket for a bike or a bus. Talking about freight, the customer wants to have their goods safe, transported in a safe way, and traced along the journey in order to be sure that the goods on the trains arrive in the due time, because for them this means cost and business. What we are focused in this cooperation is exactly this. Establish a cooperation based on the most advanced technology to manage logistic chain, which is not technology developed in Italy. It is developed in Italy, but it is done according to international standard. So it's something that you can take from the shelf and parameterize. So this is, and in my opinion, another important aspect. But this is not enough. Integration means also involvement, inclusion of small businesses. This is an approach that we have brought continuously in other countries, which means training of the people. You know, this cooperation come from a tender procedure. So we have been awarded through a tender procedure. And one of the requirements was to guarantee at the beginning of the concession 25% of BEE. And through our consortium, we have been able to guarantee that we will train the people, the local people that will work on this intermodal center according to international standards of safety and efficiency. So I think that discussing about intermodality, we should take into consideration all these aspects to allow the cake to come in the eatable.
To make the cake eatable, I like that. So that we're eating at the main table and not at the crumbs of it, as it were. Now, Mpemba, I'm going to, and you're going to get special treatment because he's my brother, as you have seen. But I didn't start with you. Ronnie, you've been, involved in particularly putting together the structures around the financial instruments that enable a lot of infrastructure development, rolling stock, and making all of these components of particularly the supply chain work. And through developing that supply chain, you've obviously then seen the importance of the value chain and supporting that in particular. So I'm now moving from the point that Nino has now made to us here this afternoon. And we can see that more and more that infrastructure projects succeed where there is partnership. They also succeed where we make a concerted effort to develop enterprises that will look after them long after perhaps the initial partnership that puts them on the ground has expired or come to the end of its useful life. And in this life cycle of deploying infrastructure, one of the big questions I think that we ask in South Africa when we talk about empowerment, skills development, enterprise development is how much of the tools and the different elements of what we deploy, how much of it is actually being developed here so that we can formally say enterprises and skills are being developed in the local market and a local market that is making locally relevant products and solutions for what it is that that infrastructure needs. I'd really like for you to unpack what you have seen as best practice around localization and how, as we structure these deals and these projects and these models around the deployment of infrastructure and intermodality and interconnectivity, how we can bring more and more of that element of competitiveness into the local markets that go on to house these projects.
So it's quite a big question. And I'll talk from two perspectives. I'll talk one as an entrepreneur, sort of putting infrastructure capacity on the continent, and I'll talk two from the perspective of, in my role as a member of the board of Africa Export-Import Bank. So you asked us what we are seeing. What we see as a starting point is a continent that has 1 billion people and growing fast, very young, with huge kind of consumption potential into the future. That's the underlying part of all this. So I agree with most of the things that Mr. Musonda said, but for us, the perspective has to be somewhat different. It can't be us investing in infrastructure capacity and industrial capacity with China in mind. It has to be us investing in this capacity with Africa in mind. A population of 1 billion is what built China. Population of 300 million is what built the US. So we can build African enterprises that service that capacity. So that's the paradigm from which we come from. So the mandate at Africa Export-Import Bank, as an example, is how do we, the question that Siyabonga was raising, how do we migrate the number, and a couple of years ago it was at 11%, and now it's circa 15%. How do we increase the number of inter-Africa trade? It's very difficult to argue that you can move that number up unless, the reason we all say Africa doesn't trade within itself is because there's no industrial capacity first. So even if you put the infrastructure, you need industrial capacity. The paradigm has to be, rather than, if you look at trade patterns, and this is where rail and ports even comes in today, if you look at trade patterns on the continent today, it's still primarily raw materials out, at a continent level, raw materials out and processed goods in. So President Ndiaye at one time said something very wise. He says, the problem is we produce what we don't consume and consume what we don't produce. And that's the beginning of the challenge for our continent, especially if you look at the size of population. So as an entrepreneurial business, all interventions that we do is really around creating industrial capacity or infrastructure capacity with that sort of background in mind. From an opportunity point of view, the continent is just, it's astounding. All the growth areas that we've gone into is not because we sat at the beginning of a process and planned it out, is because as we migrate to create, to solve one challenge, we find another, and we keep investing in those areas, so to say. And this is where, for example, you were asking about financing. A critical sort of component of our business is a business called Taylor Rolling Stock. And what we recognized is that African rail operators, even though they have a semblance of infrastructure, there is, if you look at the rolling stock infrastructure, in most part is dated. And a big part of the challenge is balance sheet capacity. So in being innovative around solutions, all we did is we structured quite a sizable pool of capital, a couple of billions of rands, and all we do is work with rail operators on the continent and global corporations where the rolling stock sits on our balance sheet. It's locomotives. We source from, we're agnostic. We've purchased equipment from Transnet, from GE, from Greenrod, really a suite of all manufacturers. And all we do is we migrate the problem for our clients from capital expenditure to operating expenditure. It sits on our balance sheet and we lease it to them over periods of time. It's very simple interventions, I think, slowly, that will allow us to then create the capacity, infrastructure, and industry that will alleviate that.
Thank you very much for those insights. And finally, and not the least, before I move to the floor, Mr. Ishmael Vandi, who is a member of the Executive Council for Roads and Transport right here in Gauteng. Gauteng, Mr. Vadi, over the last decade in particular, has invested significantly, particularly in our road infrastructure. But, whether it comes from a port, it comes off rail, it ultimately, in one format or the other, also needs to land up on a road and into a system that connects and takes it to the people, but also brings it back to the logistics interface. If you can unpack for us where the Gauteng strategy, when we're bringing this idea of intermodality home now, the Gauteng strategy, a lot of it has already been delivered, but where are we going to next? In terms of that, and how do we then look at what's the next phase of productive investments in particular in this particular region that everybody can take advantage of?
Thank you very much and good afternoon to everybody. I was heartened when I heard the applause, the spontaneous applause for Christopher, because I thought they had all fallen asleep after the lunch. but I'm quite certain that everybody's awake and listening, so thank you very much for that. My take is slightly different from the other speakers because they deal largely with issues of rolling stock and freight and logistics. Our primary concern in Gauteng is to build an integrated public transport system. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first is that apartheid spatial planning had created racially divided societies or communities. And with that, it was layered with class divisions in society in the sense that those who were wealthy, owners of the means of production, etc., were closest, living closest to the economic nodes or the industrial areas. And then black people were living much, much more further away from economic opportunities, employment opportunities, really in dormitory suburbs. The second challenge that we were trying to face is how do we bridge this gap of inequality, which is also racialized, between those who are well endowed, who tend to be white or of European origin, and then of course black people who are poor and largely unemployed currently. The third challenge that we're trying to grapple with is massive in-migration into our province. We have approximately 20,000 people coming into this province on a daily basis. So our last census was taken in 2011, October 2011. We were 13.4 million people. We are already sitting on 14.5, 14.6 million people now. And this in-migration is from other parts of our country, but Southern Africa by and large, and also other parts of the world. And we've got to find a way of managing this in-migration because geographically we are a very small province. We're the smallest in terms of geographical size and land mass. Where will we accommodate them? How do we transport them daily to work, to school, to recreational facilities, etc.? And then the last thing we're dealing with is population growth. So we can't plan for today. We've really got to plan for the future. And what the demographers and the statisticians tell us is that if we don't do anything in the next few years, really drastic and dramatic things, we will face a traffic gridlock every morning during peak hours and in the evenings. So you might have this very fancy Alfa Romeo on the highway at peak hours, but it will move at 15 kilometers per hour because of the traffic gridlock, and you'll see a donkey cart passing you at greater speed. So you've got to plan for this. Otherwise, if you leave it, you're really going to just have chaos in a matter of 10 or 15 years in this province. So what we've done is we've developed a 25-year integrated transport master plan. Integrated means aviation, rail, roads, trains, everything. How can we build a new kind of city region? Because we no longer think of Johannesburg as a single city, because there's 3 metropolitan municipalities that are contiguous to one another, and 80% of our population, so 80% of 14.5 million people now reside in these 3 metropolitan municipalities. They live in one city, Johannesburg, but they work in another city. So there's a massive movement of people on a day-to-day basis, and we don't have an integrated public transport system. We don't have a system actually. They've all been working in silos. It's really patchwork, largely catering to the needs of the former white community, those who were better endowed, and not really for those who were far from the places of economic opportunity. And that's really what we're grappling with. So in terms of a mindset shift, or change in thinking, we're saying we will have to move people off the road, of private vehicle transport, into rail. That's the biggest important shift. We will have to begin to change the way people move within cities in short distances. So either instead of motorized transport to opt for non-motorized transport. So bicycling, walking, skating, all of those kinds of things. What you see in European cities, we have to begin to create that kind of culture. And then because of the heavy congestion, we're going to have to look at sustainable options for us because of environmental pollution and all of those kinds of things that go with many cars on the road, etc. So the key point is this, that we have determined that rail will have to become the backbone of a future integrated transport system, not just in Johannesburg, but Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni. So the 3 metropolitan municipalities. So unfortunately, because of our historical systems, we have a national rail agency called the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, PRASA. They run the national rail network. But in Gauteng, although rail is not a provincial competence, we 10 years ago just took the decision that we will make it our competency, and we've launched a project called Gautrain. Some of you might have used it from the airport coming to Johannesburg. So that's a medium-speed rail system. It runs at 160 kilometers per hour. It's really the key link between Pretoria, Johannesburg, Sandton, and OR Tambo International Airport. Highly successful project. It's a 30 billion rand public-private partnership project, one of the most successful in this country. We've now just crossed over 80 million passengers since the day that the train started running. And we're now at the early stages of planning the expansion or the second phase of the Gautrain system. The current system is 85 kilometers long. We're now looking at expanding it by another 140 kilometers. This will be one of the biggest transport projects in the history of this country. We can't do it in one bite, so we're looking at a 25-year span, and this means that there's significant medium-term investment opportunities. We can't fund it through the fiscus, so we will have to look at public-private partnerships. This will be a highly modernized system with all the technology that goes with it, the depot systems, the maintenance, etc. So that's on the one side of the expansion of the Gautrain network. The second part is really our old metro rail system. These trains are 50 years, my time is up? Give me 2 minutes. These trains are about 50 years old. We can't even get some of the parts anymore. So there is a massive modernization program in place. And currently we've got Gibela has got the tender or in the bid to set up a major rail manufacturing plant not far from Johannesburg. And there it means we will be manufacturing our local trains, supplier parks, the training, the technology that goes. So there are massive, massive opportunities in the rail sector. One last word, we have to integrate that with a bus rapid transport network. So all 3 cities are at different stages of rolling that out. The pace is a bit slow. But we're looking at, if the entire plan comes into operation, we will have about 700 kilometers of BRT system, which will be the feeder to the rail network, and then of course the normal subsidized bus services, and then the taxi industry. Let me stop there.
All right. Thank you very much to Mr. Vabi. Now, on the note of public-private partnership, I'd like a partnership with everybody on the floor at this point. Where are my roving microphones? Okay, they're coming in from the back. Do we have any hands with questions for members of our panel guests? Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you can just introduce yourself from your seat and direct your question to the member of the panel you would like to respond, we would appreciate that so we can get as many diverse views and perspectives as we possibly can. Any hands? Any takers? We all know how this is going to work. There's a gentleman at the back in the blue shirt whose hand is raised.
Thank you very much. My name is Dirk Hanekom. I'm from Agri-All Africa. I haven't heard a lot about agriculture, but what you've addressed here in this session has got everything to do with agriculture. I'm not going to address a specific person because all of you actually touch on the 2 questions I have. The first one is, if you look in isolation, a little bit of background, developing railway and rolling stock and railway systems all over Southern Africa, and you do not integrate it with the other capacity like we've heard from, like Gauteng is doing. It was fascinating to listen to an integrated approach. Then I think we're going to fall short. And then if I listen to our Italian colleague, he said that you must not leave out small businesses. My question is, and going back to Mr. David Masondo from Zambia. Sir, congratulations, your country doing wonderful things. We've got many South African investments in there. But what we miss is exactly that point. We don't see sidings. There's massive agricultural developments, but people have to travel on very bad roads to get to places where they can actually ship off very high value commercially high value agricultural products that you simply can't take by road anymore. We're sitting with the potential in Zambia, for instance, with the biggest possibility of potential for the biggest macadamia, avocado, and certain subtropical produce in the world today, but we don't have the logistic to support it. I really would like to congratulate you with initiatives with Kapiri and Poshi, bringing the railway networks, Northeast African Railways, together with the Tazara railway networks, the exciting corridor developments connecting through the T5 road system to Luanda and to Lobito, going to Dar es Salaam and through Malawi to Nacala. But we must not do the oversights, because the people that turns out the money are the farmers in this instance, and we don't have a capacity. Are you thinking of these things, or you only see the big picture? This is the question maybe I must pose to my Zambian colleague and anybody else that want to answer.
Thank you very much for your question, gentlemen. Certainly, Mr. Musondo, if you could delve into a response, and it would be great to get perhaps a response from yourself, Mr. Irwin, on that same question.
Thank you very much. I almost thought the question was going to my Minister of Finance, who is sitting in front of me. Basically, I think I'll ask him to comment. But let me say this. There's a policy coming up in Zambia. Remember, I mentioned the optimization. There's a policy coming to Zambia to say that a certain percentage, roughly 30%, of the heavy bulk materials should move by rail. Now, this is not babysitting railway. This is just trying to see whether we can optimize the utilization of heavy bulk appropriately, because the opportunity of growth can also be destructive if it's not properly managed. In this country before, there was a quota system where some commodities could only move by rail, until it reached a point where that quota system became irrelevant, because South African transport services became self-sufficient to move forward. And I think once we do the 30% bulk heavy move from road to rail, it answers the issue of the nature of roads in Zambia. It also answers the issue of economic of scales for railways. Now, when this has been announced, we've been discussing with our colleagues in South Africa that if 30% grows in Zambia, it automatically, like Zimbabwe Railways, Transnet, which is TFR, will also grow automatically by 30%. And it gives us an opportunity as a corridor. How do we handle this growth of 30%? And these are how the relationship we start developing with neighboring railways. This integration we start doing with neighboring railways. Because if we fail in Zambia to move 30% by rail, everybody will say, we told you, railways let you down. So we need to succeed to move by that. And that 30% is not enough. 30%, if it comes by registration, we need another percentage which comes by railways being attractive. Because if we depend on the registration to give us tonnage, it's not sustainable. It should be the initial push. Once we get that initial push, we move forward with the registration or without registration by way of growing in terms of tonnage. Well, the biggest problem we're having as railway in the region today, we don't have enough business. We don't have enough business. What has happened over the years is that my colleagues were talking about wagons and locomotives. If you look at the railway series from Congo to here, the biggest amount of wagons we had were general purpose wagons, open wagons, and we still have them. The market has changed. The market is looking for closed wagons, locked wagons like containers, and that's where our deficiencies are. So in the middle of having so many open wagons, we still have a shortage of appropriate customer-demanded wagons. That's why we must lease. That's why we must lease, otherwise we shall continue buying. This is where now the leasing comes in. Now, when you talk about leasing, this is where the balance sheet comes in. And therefore, To grow this infrastructure we are talking about in the railways model, we need also to find the solution to balance sheets. Because balance sheets will delay us move where we want to move. Unless the issue of balance sheet is sorted out, it will become a constraint to move forward. So this is a thing we have, but in Zambia, as you know, which you seem to know very well, we have had roads being maintained every 3-4 years. Some of them should have been maintained after 15 years, 20 years. So the imbalance in utilization of transport sector becomes a constraint. So in terms of optimization, there's a point which each one of us has a role, and if you reach that optimal point, you become efficient and you move things efficiently. I thought I should make comments, but my minister is here. I think he's very familiar with.
Well, let me allow Mr. Irwin to make a comment, and perhaps whilst he does, can I have one of the roving microphones come to the front? I know there's a gentleman at the back who is also possibly signaling to us that he also has a question, and a lady through the middle. So we'll just keep that microphone moving around. So if you can bring it to Minister Motati at the front, and then the second microphone, there's a gentleman at the back, and then a lady in the middle from there.
Thank you, and taken by ambush by Mr. Msonda. I've got a short presentation that I'm going to make soon after this meeting. So maybe let it be integrated so that you have what is it that we're doing as Zambia to optimize? What is it that we're doing in the area of minimizing the cost of doing business, including transaction costs? So I'll touch on that.
Thank you very much, Honourable Minister. We do appreciate that. Mr. Irwin, if you can also just add your contribution.
I'm very glad that the question was asked, because when we think about rail, my argument would be we have to fundamentally rethink the paradigm of rail. So what are the basics we know about Africa? We know that agriculture is going to be a much, much bigger industry than it is now. Not only is it fundamental to Africa, it's going to be fundamental for the world. So along with South America and parts of Asia, we're going to be growing food for the world. So we have to start thinking now, how can we move that agricultural product more effectively? We know, as Ronnie was saying, that our raw materials will increasingly have to be beneficiated here. So how do we move the raw material from mine to beneficiation site? And we know that our passengers and people will want to move more efficiently and quickly. If you think of what Ismail said about Gauteng, think of Lagos at nearly 18 million people with far less infrastructure. Look at the challenges you've got in Lagos or Nairobi or the big Nigerian cities. So we know that rail will remain a fundamental means of transport, but the economics of it is changing. So the days where you could have a train that had maybe 15 wagons on and moved at an average speed of 35 kilometers, that cannot possibly compete with the modern freight road transport. It's just impossible. So when we think about rail, we have to start thinking of average speeds of 90 to 100. I'm talking about freight now, not passenger. We've got to start thinking in that region of 90 to 100K. That means we need bigger trains, because with bigger trains, higher speeds, you can immediately compete with road over distances. Over shorter distances, road will still outcompete you because of the specificity of the particular trips. So what we've got to think about in rail now is corridors, inland ports. So we get trains moving fast over 700 kilometers, stopping for 20 minutes, loading and moving. The road brings us to the intermodal ports and the cost changes. So this is not something that the private sector should be expected they can do, because the project risks of doing that are so high. So what we see in South Africa, and I'm very glad Ismail Vadi spoke, I watched the African cities. The only one that did something sensible was this one. And why did they do it? Because they suddenly had a transport plan. They actually thought about it and did something. So the challenge for African governments, or for, unfortunately, and I'll come to Transnets in a moment, they have to rethink how the economy is going to work to meet the agricultural needs, the industrial needs, the mining needs, and the commuter needs. So the rail must be taken seriously, and it's intermodal because you're going to have everyone else. So at the moment, we're asking big state in South Africa, we're fortunate. Nowhere else in Africa are there state corporations that are as large with a balance sheet as this. But even a Transnet cannot undertake this kind of long-term structural reinvestment. It has to be done as a state-led issue and then in public-private partnerships. But what I would urge is that a Transnet and an Italian partner can think through solutions, because you can help government think through a solution to these issues. The South African system of agriculture, sorry to talk so long, but you remember we had branch lines. We tried to revive the branch lines. Actually, you can't. And the reason you can't revive the branch lines is they cannot compete with road. They're old, trains are too small. So unless you subsidize them massively, which is an option, but why not put a more efficient system in place with faster rail trunks, intermodals into it, and then we'll create agriculture. At the moment, no matter how good your agricultural projects, and they're wonderful, the logistics are still defeating them. And last point, I mean, the future of agriculture in many, many respects is the cold chain. Because increasingly you're going to start processing your agricultural products closer to the point of production. Now, cold chains can't be worked easily over long distances in the absence of rail. So we really have to start rethinking these things, have strategies for them. You know, when Ismail and his team in Gauteng start thinking about an integrated transport strategy, they should be thinking about how they move the product in Gauteng quickly. You've got to think about that.
All right. Can I go to the question from the gentleman at the back? Can you just, by show of hands, show the young lady? Is it no longer a question, sir? All right. Can I have it transferred to the lady? She's in the middle. She's already got a microphone. Thank you very much.
I have a microphone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Renee Talliard from Economic Research, Southern Africa, but I happen to be here today courtesy of the Social Cohesion Champions in Gauteng, which is something I'd like to urge you all to find something out more about that. I just want to drill down into the financing question and perhaps to table a question to our Italian guests. When we're looking at financing models, I would assume that when you look at the rail upgrades that happened in Italy in the past 2 decades, there would have been a split between public-private capital, European structural regional funds, and I'm curious about the balance between the different sources of revenue that financed both the commuter and the freight-related rail upgrades in Italy. And to take that back into our context, and Siyabonga and Alec would both know from their own history in their various roles, that the gearing, even though we have a very, very good entity in Transnet, that the gearing of Transnet has always been a significant challenge. And we don't necessarily have the luxury of European Union-related structural funds. And if we couple that with the challenge of creating a SADC-wide infrastructure focus to capitalize on intermodal transport that is not only in-country but regional for economies of scale, we surely have to also think through the difficulties in differentiating between different currencies, different regimes for profit repatriation based on different exchange rate, different exchange control regimes that may be in place. I really want to ask a very detailed question on the financing, because that is really, we all know where the rubber hits the road. So the question is twofold. Firstly, to our Italian guests, what was the modality of the split, public-private, EU regional funds, and then throwing that back into our regional context? Thank you.
About the model that that we have in Europe, we say in Italy, but we are saying in Europe because we are integrated in the Europe Union. Basically, the modality to finance is this. European Union, finance part of the corridors. So the corridors which are sovereign interest in Europe among different countries are financed partially by Europe through contribution. I'm talking, for example, just to give you 2 examples, the tunnel between high-speed tunnel between France and Italy, or the freight and passengers corridor between Italy and Austria. These are two examples where European Union financed partially the construction. We don't have, this is for infrastructure, strategic corridors, what we call TEN, Trans-European Network. Talking about transport is not subsidized by Europe, in the sense that we have two kinds of transport. Market trains, which are completely not subsidized because are profitable. For example, high-speed trains, where we make money on this kind of business. And we have the subsidized services, which are the services that are not profitable, but still have to continue because of social benefit and requirements. These kind of services are subsidized by regions, by the state, through contracts. Established with key performance indicators and open to the public tenders. So inside the European Union, you can bid for commuters rail in France or in Holland or in Sweden, whatever. These are the two kind of way of financing infrastructure and transport system.
Thank you, Nico, for that response. Perhaps can I then bounce it across to you, Mr. Gama, just to give some context in terms of those considerations that have been posed through this question.
Yeah. I think, from where we sit, we don't have a system that is being subsidized. The government says, go and create a sustainable business that's able to stand alone. Very good policy. So everything that we have to do, we need to be able to repay it, and we issue bonds in the market, and we have to repay it. But I think in Europe it's a slightly better system, because even the ports as well as the rail, some of the public infrastructure, you can be able to subsidize it. But I think some of the issues around how we're going to be able to regionally integrate. They also talk to probably a need for a regional master plan. A regional master plan that begins to say, from a micro perspective, from a country perspective, what is it that is required? But how do you then integrate these things from an SADC, from a SADC perspective? How do you pull together the political and economic forces in order to have a vision that is financeable? Because a vision alone is interesting, but you need to be able to finance it in order for the interoperability to take place, so that the regional platforms that we require in order for us to interconnect can work. Because, for instance, if you make an investment in South Africa, but you're incapable of making the same investment in Mozambique, in Zambia or Zimbabwe, you're going to clog the terrain. So you need to therefore be able to say, how can the governments then act in unison, and how can you finance that kind of infrastructure in order for us to be able to move forward. So there is a great deal of requirement in terms of an agreement on what kind of infrastructure is going to move us forward. Issues around the security, the food security issues. How do we move products to where they are required, from where the markets are to where the producers are? How do you do that as cheaply as possible in terms of making sure that we're efficient? How do you make sure that consumers and the users of these commodities have got choices in terms of what modal or nodal shifts are required in order for us to do that? So I think all of these are quite an involved perspective, but I think also what we began to talk about today is the notion of partnerships, foreign direct investment into Africa, with an Italian entity investing with the South African to create major infrastructure, which is a 20-year, 25-year project. And I think that has to be welcomed because, as Alec was indicating, the public sector on its own cannot come up with the kind of funding that is required. Probably if Transnet comes up with 500 billion over the next 10 years, we would like the private sector to come up with another 750 billion. And every year, the underinvestment in infrastructure on the continent rises by $100 billion. So there's a huge issue here, and the issue of financing is actually quite critical in terms of how you deal with it. We need our development funding institutions to come in and say, if Africa must rise and if infrastructure investments must take place and we want economic development, what kind of funding models are we going to come up with that will assist us to move forward?
All right. Ronnie, I see you also want to add to Mr. Gama's comments around the financing structure. Are there any further hands on the floor? There is one right at the back. I'll take that as our last question in respect to time, and then we'll start to wrap up from the stage around those questions. But before we go to our final question, can I have a comment from Mr. Ntuli? And then so I'll come to you before I come back to my stage again.
I appreciate the nepotism. So the question Renette raises is a very important question, and Siyabonga begins to answer a big part of it. See, the first part, and the Italian example and the European example is very interesting. The first part is we have to understand at a macro level is we talk about industrial value chains. There's also a capital value chain, right? So if you start with a capital value chain, you'll realize the importance of planting industry on the continent, planting infrastructure, because that creates jobs. Jobs create salaries, salaries create savings, tax. The reason the European Union can do those funding programs subsidized is because they're collecting tax. There's a pool of money that can be deployed to priority projects. That's the first, at a macro level. So as a continent, it's not a joke when we say we have to create industrial capacity because that stuff leads to that capital value chain. That's at a macro level. At a more micro level, there's a couple of multilateral African institutions that recognize that African risk is misinterpreted from a capital point of view. And what they're doing is really position themselves as arbitraging African risk in relation to global capital for African development. ADB, Afrexim Bank, Africa 50, which is born specifically for infrastructure, become very interesting because that ability to become a capital absorption point, understanding African risk, mitigating that African risk, finding projects that are, and in their view, sorry, and this will be my last point, in their view, the problem is not global interest, capital interest in Africa. The challenge has been packaged projects that are fundable, very few credible on the continent. So at a macro level, very interesting because we have to take this long journey, but at a micro level, what you're starting to see is very dedicated institutions that recognize that there's a need to arbitrage African risk from a capital point of view.
It'll be very interesting, perhaps at a later stage, to establish from the floor who has approached some of those institutions and the models that they've built from, and what's come out of that, in order to help us share that knowledge and best practice, because I think more and more those become very relevant points and steps that we all have to think about, irrespective of where we choose to land our investments across the region. To the gentleman at the back who has got a microphone, please pose your question.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Given Mashikwana from Mashikwana Cooperative. The only question that I have for you guys there in front is, how do you guys plan for small business? How do you guys strategize to develop small business in township, small businesses, agriculture and township? How is your planning to develop those businesses in terms of to put it in an international standard? Because I do believe that as Africans, we could have made a mark in the world if we were focusing on agriculture, because our country or our African continent is very rich in our soil. For China, it has a strategy in technology and is very best in technology, and I think their government is investing a lot in technology. If our government in Africa or in South Africa would invest a lot in agriculture, I think we would make a little bit of a mark in that terms.
Can I specifically bank your question? Because my next round table has 2 individuals on it who can go to town with a response for you. So if I can bank your question for my next round table, and then we can unpack some of the very relevant and prevalent issues your question unpacks, okay? Thank you very much. Nino, I know you had a comment, and so did you, Mr. Vadi. If we can close on those 2 points in respect to my timer, so that we can then give Minister Mutati an opportunity to come to the podium.
No, I just want to add something related to what Mr. Gama said, in the sense that in our experience, financing infrastructure is something that the government should intervene, because an infrastructure project, build a new railways, is something expensive, and you will never find tickets or rates for goods able to make this investment profitable. So the government should always intervene, especially in the large corridors. This is the experience of Europe. But this is the intervention of the state is positive, because otherwise the customers go by trucks, goes by car, and the social cost of this choice is worse than financing rail infrastructure. That's why the state is financing infrastructure, because it's more convenient from benefit point of view.
Thank you very much for that. Ishmael?
The ideal is that light and heavy freight should move on rail, particularly in our province. But the reality is that 80% of it actually moves on the road. And from where we sit, we are quite clear that this is not going to change, at least in the next 10 or 15 years. So we're taking a pragmatic view. We are upgrading our roads, maintaining them, rehabilitating them, particularly those in the outlying areas, particularly in support of the agricultural sector. We've upgraded our freeways with the tolling system, which is politically, I think, quite controversial now. Some people are paying and others are not paying. But we have no choice. We have to build fairly modern freeway networks for ease of mobility in our province. And the big question is, if we abandon the e-tolling system, what is the alternative in terms of funding and financing that kind of infrastructure? Our main concern really is not Gauteng. I think we're getting a handle on the road network and the challenges we have. But every truck going out of Gauteng to another province or another part of Southern Africa, or coming in, traverses other provinces. And we have no control over that network, or those, the movement of people there. So we've done, I think, historically quite well on the Maputo-Gauteng corridor. But our challenge really is Botswana, South Africa, Limpopo, Johannesburg, Limpopo, Zimbabwe, and then, of course, Johannesburg, Namibia. And we can control our part of it, but we don't have control over other sides. So we really need to look at an inter-regional approach to this matter so that we can strengthen the corridor and ease of mobility across it.
All right. Thank you very much to you, Mr. Vadi, for your final comments. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you will all agree, particularly if we go back to our opening positioning paper this afternoon, that the triggers that physical infrastructure deploys out into our economies, into our markets, into the experience that you and I have, not just to the movement of our goods, the movement of our money, but also the movement of people and how cities and the infrastructure around those cities grows, is absolutely pivotal, and it's something and an opportunity within the value chain for each of us to look at quite closely. Thank you very much to my panel guests. I do ask them to stay on stage with me, with the exception of Mr. Gama, who I will excuse at this point in time, as I welcome to the microphone this afternoon our next speaker, who is the Finance Minister of Zambia this afternoon, the Honorable Minister Motati, who will be chatting to us this afternoon and giving us a little bit of an insight around financing infrastructure in particular, and perhaps sharing some best practice and some case studies of how that's worked in his own country and also out of his own experience. Please give him a very warm round of applause.